And in Florence, a shooting killed a man and injured 2 women overnight. Deputies found the victims in the 1400 block of East 77th Street just before 1 o'clock. All 3 went to the hospital where a man was pronounced dead. Both women have already been released. The LA County Sheriff's Department says there is no information on any suspects or if the shooting was gang-related.
Linked to the South LA gang Florence 13.
Massive burglary ring busted tonight. Authorities have arrested 2 suspects accused of at least 30 break-ins across Southern California.
In today's video, we're going to be speaking about a situation that would happen between the East Coast Crips and Florence 13, to where a triple shooting would leave 1 man dead and 2 others wounded. And we're also going to break down how the suspects would be from East Coast Crip, and they would also be charged with 30+ burglaries. But let's dive right into it. In the early morning of August 19th of 2017, around 12:45 in the morning, a shooting would happen on the 1400 block of East 77th Street. And as you can see, the shooting would happen in the red circle, and this would be in 7-6 East Coast Crip territory. And on that day, 5 people were on bikes traveling south on Parmley Street, and they would take a turn onto 77th Street. That's when somebody in a white Jeep Cherokee would approach, and they would get into an exchange with the people on the bike. But after they exchanged words, the white Jeep Cherokee would drive away, and a black Honda would pull up, and 3 people in that Honda would open fire on the group. The driver, the passenger, and the rear passenger would all open fire. The backseat passenger would open fire on one of the females, hitting her just below the waist, and 2 more shots would graze her ribcage and her elbow. And the other 2 shooters would hit Ramirez and another female who was riding on the back of his bike. And the female would be hit just below the waist, and Ramirez was shot in the back. And Ramirez was a member of Florence 13, and he also had an F13 tattooed on his body, with a couple of people in the comments saying that he went by the nickname Lencho. However, police would gather surveillance footage, and they would find out that the Honda that was used in the shooting was actually stolen. But like we said, this triple shooting took place at 12:45 in the morning. And after that, police would be looking for the black stolen Honda all day. And eventually, just a few hours later, they would find the black stolen Honda in 7-6 East Coast Crip territory. And they would see somebody with the name Sean Ray Jr. standing next to the stolen Honda. They would then arrest him, and they would search the stolen vehicle, to where they would recover a loaded 9mm pistol. Sean Ray Jr. is a member of East Coast Crip, and just so there's no confusion, we're just going to address him as Ray. But like we just said, he was arrested on the same exact day of the murder, which was August 19th of 2017, just hours later. And he was spotted with the stolen Honda, and they found a loaded gun inside of the vehicle. And after running his name, police would learn that he was on a $25,000 bail for being arrested 6 days before this, because he was arrested on August 13th of 2017, and he was found with another loaded pistol. And since the stolen vehicle was used in a murder, police decided to do ballistic tests on both the pistols that he was caught with, the one from the day previous on August 13th of 2017, and the one that was in the stolen vehicle. In the pistol that he was caught with on August 13th of 2017, it would come back to a shooting on August 8th of 2017, just a few days prior. And this shooting took place on Parmley Avenue. And on that day, police recovered 2 9mm casings and 2 40mm casings. And police would get a warrant to search his Instagram, and they would see a post on August 9th of 2017, which would be a day after the shooting on Parmley Avenue. And they would see that he posted a story on his Instagram saying that a member of Florence 13 shot at his car. And police are alleging that him and this F13 member got into a shootout, because like we said, the 9mm casings would come back to his gun, and a member of F13 was arrested a few days later, and they would recover a .40 caliber on him, and them shell casings would also match. And the 9mm that was found in the stolen vehicle would come back to the same shell casings found at the murder. But the charges wouldn't stop there, because just 2 months later, Ray and 3 others would be arrested on October 7th of 2017, and they would all be hit with a 36-count indictment. Let's break it down. The first 27 counts are just 27 counts of robbery. They would also be hit with 1 count of murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, 1 count of shooting at an inhabited dwelling or vehicle, and 2 counts of carrying a concealed weapon in a vehicle. And after police learned about both shootings on August 8th and August 19th, they would start to do an investigation. And police would decide to do a Perkins operation on all the suspects, but they started off with the first co-defendant with the last name Wise. And he would be questioned on January 8th of 2018, which would be 3 months after the arrest. And they would place Wise in a cell with a confidential informant with the fake name of Stanley, and the confidential informant was getting paid $1,500. The conversation would start off with the informant asking Wise where he was from, and Wise would reply and say 7-6 East Coast. And after a short while of him sitting in the cell, a detective would enter and say he needed to speak with him about a homicide that happened last August. And he would tell Wise that his name came up in it, but he was waiting for his partner to get there so they can speak about it. Wise then responded and said he didn't know what he was speaking about. The detective would then answer and say it was alright, and then he would walk away. And they would have this conversation in front of the informant. And when the detective walked away, the informant would tell Wise to use his brain and figure out that somebody was telling on him. The informant would then say that he was trying to help Wise out. And Wise would tell the informant that he had no clue what the detective was talking about. The informant would then ramble on about going to court. And then eventually Wise would respond again, and he would tell the informant that he didn't know what the police were talking about. The informant would then respond and tell Wise that police knew something and that they had to have evidence. And he would say that he knew what he was talking about because he was an OG. He would then say, at the end of the day, they got you on a homicide. Use your mind and consider things like self-defense. Detectives would then come back and take Wise out of the cell to interrogate him. And after the interrogation, he would go back to the cell with the informant. And even though he denied the shooting 2 times to the informant, when he got back to the cell, he would tell the informant that police were talking about a shooting. Wise would then tell the informant that police showed him pictures of the vehicles used in the shooting. The informant would then respond and say, "You have to clear me up so I can help you out," and that somebody was telling on him. Wise would then tell the informant that one vehicle used was stolen and the other vehicle was his co-defendant's. The informant would then ask which co-defendant it was, and he would respond and identify Ray as the person with the car. And he would say that Ray's girlfriend was in the front seat and that she was also in jail. The informant would then ask Wise if there were 2 people in the back seat, and he would ask Wise what happened to his gun. Wise would then respond and say that his gun jammed, and he would say that the other person that was with him was Godbolt, and he would say that the female's name was Sierra. So now he just told the informant that 2 vehicles were used, and one was stolen and one was Ray's. He would then identify Ray and identify Godbolt and the female, and he would also place himself in the vehicle as a shooter. The informant would then ramble on for a few minutes about snitching, and eventually Wise would cut him off and say, "I was in the back seat." The informant would then speculate and try to convince Wise that Godbolt was the snitch. And after this conversation, the detectives would take Wise out of the cell again, and they would interview him another time. And this time they would tell Wise that they had witnesses and people who placed them in the back seat of the vehicle that did the shooting on August 19th. And that these same witnesses said that Wise was shooting out of the window. And detectives would also say that they identified Wise as being present during the shooting on August 8th of 2017. And what's crazy is that the detectives were lying. As you can see in red, it says neither statement was true. And Wise would deny both charges, but either way that wouldn't matter because he was talking to the informant without even knowing. And that conversation that he had with the informant would make the detectives' evidence way more solid, because now they would know that the stolen Honda was definitely used in the shooting. They would learn that Wise was in the back seat. They would learn how many guns were used, and they would also learn that Wise's gun jammed. And he would also place Ray and Godbolt on the scene. They would then take Wise back to the county jail, and the next person they would interview would be Godbolt, which would be 4 days later, on January 12th of 2018. But this time they would use 2 confidential informants, and one of them happened to be Stanley, which was the one that was talking to Wise. They would then place Godbolt back in the cell with the informants, and they would ask him where he was from. He would then respond and say that he was from East Coast Crip, and that they were trying to give him a life sentence for some robberies. Godbolt would then say that he was in there for 22 robberies and a home invasion. They would all 3 then continue to talk about the 22 robberies, and then eventually the conversation shifted to talking about guns. Godbolt told the informants that he was 19 and hoped to be home by the time he was 30. And Godbolt would tell the informants that he's never been to jail before. And shortly after, the detective working the case would come to the cell and introduce himself. He would then tell Godbolt that he wanted to speak with him about a murder that happened in Compton last year, and that he had to wait for his partner to arrive. And once the detective walked away, the informant would tell Godbolt that somebody was snitching on him and somebody threw his name under the bus. Godbolt then responded and said this is crazy and that one of his homies got caught with a gun and it got him shaken. And the informant would say that he was speaking from experience and that somebody was telling on him. And even though Godbolt never been in jail, he would agree with the informant. Detectives then took Godbolt out of the cell and they would interrogate him. And this right here is where things get crazy, because as you can see right there in the bottom paragraph, while he was being questioned by detectives, they would falsely tell Godbolt that they found his DNA in the stolen vehicle. Godbolt would then deny it and say he didn't know anything about any gangs and that he never been in the car during the shooting. And this is where things get even crazier, because detectives would even go as far as to show Godbolt a fake DNA test report. And after they were done interrogating him, they would place him back in the cell with the informants, and the informants would ask him if he was doing alright, and he would respond and say he was straight. The informants would then ask if people were snitching, and Godbolt would respond and say, yeah, people put my name in it. And Godbolt would even tell the informants that detectives found his DNA in the vehicle. The informant would then ask him who they shot, and he would say it was somebody from Florence. The informant would then ask Godbolt if he had a feeling of which one was the snitch, and Godbolt would say yeah. And he would say again that they had his DNA and that they interviewed everybody, but he wasn't telling them anything. Godbolt would then tell the informants that they found no gun. The informant would then ask whose vehicle it was, and Godbolt would respond and say it was a stolen vehicle. Godbolt would say that one of his homies went down for the stolen car, and he knew police questioned him first. The informant would then say that Godbolt's crimey was the B word, referring to Ray, and Godbolt would agree with the informant. But little did he know that Ray hasn't even been interrogated yet. And he would even tell the informants that they asked him about the August 8th shooting, and they would ask him if he was with Ray during the shooting, and he would answer and say he didn't remember. Godbolt then told the informants that the murder happened 5 months ago, and he would say that Ray was also there, and he would place 4 people on the scene, because he would say all 3 of them, and then he would correct himself and say all 4 of us, and then he would say the girl was in the car with us. The informant then asked Godbolt what gun he was shooting that night, and Godbolt would respond and say a Glock 17, but he threw it away. The informant then asked him how many people were shot that night, and he would respond and say that somebody died, and he would also say that I hit somebody for sure. I hit somebody for sure that night. Godbolt would then tell the informant that all they got on him was him being in the vehicle, and that's not good enough evidence, and that he could have been in the vehicle a day before that for all they know. But little did he know, he was being recorded by a confidential informant. Godbolt would then tell the informant that Ray was arrested with a stolen vehicle, and they found him with a firearm that was used in the shooting. And the informant would tell Godbolt that Ray had to be snitching and ask for a deal, and Godbolt would agree. But Ray didn't snitch or ask for a deal. And if you remember correctly, this would be the same informant, Stanley, that got Wise to think Godbolt was telling, and now he's getting Godbolt to think Ray was telling. And it even went as far as the informant convincing Godbolt to beat up Ray if he came across him. And the last thing he would tell the informant is that the girl was driving and that all 3 of them were hanging out the window shooting. And eventually, they would take Godbolt back to the county jail. And the last person to be hit with the Perkins operation would be Ray. And his situation would happen on January 17th of 2018, which would be 5 days after Godbolt. But this time, they would use an informant that said he was from Chicago. He would then ask Ray what he was in for and where he was from. And Ray would respond and say he was from East Coast and he was in there for a home invasion and that they're trying to give him life. And the same detective would walk in and say he needed to speak with Ray about a murder that happened last August, but he said he'll be right back and they'll be able to chop it up. Detectives would tell Ray that they had his DNA in the stolen vehicle. They would also say that they had witnesses that stated he committed a shooting on August 8th. And as you can see in red again, the detectives would be lying to him, and neither of these statements would be true. They would also show Ray a fake photo lineup, and they would show him that his picture was being circled by a witness, even though it was a lie. Police would then bring him back to the cell with the informant, and Ray would tell the informant that he was being charged with murder, and that they found his DNA in the stolen vehicle that was used in the shooting. He would then tell the informant that police told him that they wouldn't tell him anything unless if he gave up information, and that Ray was the last one that they interrogated. The informant then told Ray that police knew way more than they were telling him. Ray would then tell the informant that they had a photo lineup with his face circled. The informant would then say that if police didn't have evidence, they wouldn't file the charges against Ray, and Ray agreed with him. And even though Ray just told him that they found the DNA inside of the stolen vehicle, the informant would ask Ray if they found the vehicle. Ray would then tell him again that they found the vehicle and they found his DNA inside of the vehicle. That's when the informant would tell Ray to go with self-defense. The informant would then get on Ray for not wearing any gloves, and Ray would say that they were filing because of a snitch. Ray would tell the informant that he didn't say anything to police. The informant would then say that somebody was for sure snitching. That's when he would ask who they were shooting at. Ray would then say they were walking down the street and the people didn't shoot back because they didn't have a chance. The informant would then tell Ray that he needed to switch up the story. He would then tell Ray that he needed to know exactly what happened so that way he can help Ray switch up the story. And that's when Ray would say that they just pulled up on them and started smacking on them and then drove off. The informant from Chicago would then ask Ray if he got rid of the gun. And that's when Ray would tell him that he didn't have it in his possession, but it was in the stolen vehicle that he was found next to. And shortly after that, an officer would come to the cell to take Ray's fingerprints. And when Ray asked why he was doing that, the officer would respond and say he was being charged with a murder. But 2 years after being arrested, all three of them would take a plea deal on the 27 counts of robbery on August 1st of 2019. And on that same day, they would be found guilty by a jury on the rest of the counts, which would be 1 count of murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of shooting at an inhabited dwelling or vehicle. And they would take a plea deal on the last 2 counts of carrying a concealed weapon in a vehicle. And we're gonna start off with Ray's sentence first, and he would get 270 years to life. In Godbolt, he would get the same exact thing of 270 years to life. In Wise, he would get 210 years to life. But that right there is gonna wrap it up for this story, and I appreciate you guys for tuning in. And may the victim that we spoke about in this story rest in peace. But comment, like, and subscribe. I appreciate y'all. It's respectable rants.